الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد ذي القدر العظيم وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Welcome to our weekly Q&A session from Seekers Hub Toronto. And we have a few questions that we're going to begin with, inshallah ta'ala.
So the first question is there anything such as Islamic banking in the West?
Is there anything such as Islamic banking in the West? Yes. The short answer is that, there in the Sharia, there are rulings that are clear, which everyone knows. And there are rulings that are nuanced, that either are known by scholars, or there's rulings that are both nuanced and specialized, that are known by specialist scholars, just like anything else. Medicine. Someone has a simple headache, say, okay, take a Tylenol, take an Advil, etc. That's, anyone would know. Your back is hurting, a little light massage would do, whatever. It's common sense. You have a cough, get some cough medicine, whatever. And then there's some things that require a doctor and some things require a specialist. So one of the major areas of contemporary research in Islamic law, in fiqh, relates to contemporary contracts, contemporary financial contracts. And in this area, like any new area, there's a range of difference of opinion. But there's a few underlying issues. The first is, we have to be very clear that one of the most firmly prohibited actions in Islam is the taking of riba, or engaging in riba transactions, engaging in transactions involving interest or usury, riba. Nothing has been prohibited more sternly in the Quran or in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. If you look at the verses on the prohibition of riba, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that if you do not desist, فَأْذَنُوا بِحَرْبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. If you do not desist from it, then be well aware of a proclamation of war, harb, of war from Allah and His Messenger. There's nothing that has been, no action that has been warned about as sternly in the Quran as the taking of riba, or is the engaging in riba, whether charging riba or paying it. And riba arises from contracts, right? From contracts. So it's a branch. Islamic finance and banking, for example, is a branch of commercial law. It's commercial law. And commercial law is one of the areas of law, of fiqh. And it requires specialists. So when it comes to the prohibition of riba, there are alternatives. Some alternatives simply fulfill the baseline of not falling into what is legally considered riba. Right? That's important to appreciate. Any kind of financing transaction, whether it be a loan or an investment or a mortgage, etc., ultimately it's a contract between two parties. The financing parties and the person taking the financing. So the least thing is that there may be some contracts that take one out of that which is Islamically considered to be riba. And that's the minimum. Right? That's the minimum. The prohibition of riba has higher aims related to social justice, related to equity, related to opportunity, right? Related to the economic health and well-being and economic justice of communities and societies, etc. Right? But we need to be going from contracts that are merely permissible to contracts that are both permissible and that fulfill these higher socio-economic aims. But one should not discount the tremendous spiritual consequence of going out from being in a state of major sin, of major prohibition by falling in riba, to being in a state where what one is doing is transactionally considered to be permissible. And at an international level, the ulama specialized in the area of commercial transactions and financial transactions. They have a number of large bodies of scholars that set standards for what are considered Sharia compliant financial transactions. One of these bodies is called AOFI, AAOIFI, Accounting and Auditing Organization for Islamic Financial Institutions. One of the worst acronyms out there. But some of the leading scholars are involved in this. And this sets what are called standards, ma'ayir shar'iyya, regarding the various types of transactions. Recently they came up, after years of deliberation and research, to a معيار شرعي في المعاملات الذهبية, that they came up with Sharia standards, consensus standards, when it comes to transacting in gold, right? Because there are particular limits related to transactions with gold. There's limits that Allah and His Messenger have placed regarding that. So they place these standards. Why? So that the complex, nuanced issues that have wide impact are dealt with in a rigorous, researched, consultative, deliberative manner. Similarly, the Islamic Fiqh Academy, Al-Majma' al-Fiqh al-Islami, which again gathers some of the senior-most scholars, also has done decades of research when it comes to these major issues, right? And there are financial institutions that are compliant with these, with the range of contemporary scholarly research that, and sometimes there's difference of opinion, particularly with the Islamic Fiqh Academy, right? But there's a range of opinions that are considered mainstream, that are considered sound. And some scholars may disagree on some particulars, and that's from the richness of our tradition, right? But then there are opinions that would be considered aberrant, given all that contemporary research has said in our times, to be arguing that bank interest is not riba, is considered to be stepping outside the overwhelming agreement of the major scholars of the ummah, right? And those opinions, they're very dangerous, high-risk opinions to take. Because if 99 experts say that your house is at the risk of collapsing, but one says no, you wouldn't live in that house because one or two people say no, it won't collapse, but everyone else says no, your house is going to collapse within the next 5 years. You won't let your family remain there. But if the overwhelming majority of the specialist scholars of the ummah say that this transaction that you're engaged in is riba, but you found one or two that says, no, it's not, why make your eternal well-being dependent on something that dangerous? So there are such, in general, we don't recommend any specific products or services, but generally, a way of safety is that are the specific transactions, the specific contracts of the institution that you're working with, compliant with the AOFI standards. Right? These are the recognized and accepted standards, as confirmed specifically by recognized specialists in contemporary Islamic financial transactions and commercial law, right? Scholars of recognized expertise in this field, like anything else. In the absence of that, because the AOFI standards are quite strict, at least that your transactions have been reviewed and approved specifically. Your specific offerings have been reviewed and approved by scholars who are recognized experts in this field. And beware of false claims. Some people say, we are following the fatwa of so-and-so. Right? I can say, okay, I'm following Einstein. Doesn't make me someone capable of talking about whatever Einstein was talking about. Theory, this and that. Right? That are the specific transactions approved, right? Are certified, right? By recognized scholars. So one should do some due diligence oneself. We had in one absurd case, this company was claiming that our transactions have been approved by a certain mufti. All the contracts were in English, and the mufti does not read nor understand English. So how did he approve it? Right? And these are, these kinds of things. One should be careful and confirm. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala. So yes, there are sound Sharia compliant modes of Islamic financing, and these are available. If you go to seekershub.org, we have a reader on riba and mortgages, etc., that highlights what is a mainstream position on interest, its taking and its giving. But it's if you want to take care of the spiritual and religious well-being of yourself and your family, keep completely away from riba. Right? Don't take, as those ulama of Halab, of Aleppo, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect it from fitna and from tribulations. There's a saying that I learned from some of the scholars from Halab, that خُذْ fatwa tunjik, la fatwa turdik. Take a fatwa that will be a means for your salvation. Don't just take a fatwa that is pleasing to you. Right? Because religion is about making the choices that are a means for eternal success. Right? Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala alam.
So the second question is, I have a son that has disabilities. Would it be permissible to get a dog for him to aid with his disabilities?
So can one get a dog to aid a child or an adult with disabilities? In general, right, one doesn't keep dogs as mere pets. Right? However, in the Sharia, we see that it is permitted to keep a dog as a shepherd dog, right? Or as a guard dog outside of the home, right? And there's basis in that. Particularly, for example, the hadith in Sunan Abi Dawood and elsewhere, the Prophet ﷺ was praying on a journey when he was, with one of the tribes, and there were dogs walking in front of him. Dogs and cattle. And there's permission in the Sharia for shepherd dogs and guard dogs, etc. From that, when there is a need, right? When there is a need that cannot otherwise be fulfilled, it would be permitted to have a guide dog in the household. Right? But one has to look at what are the circumstances, what is the option, what are the options. Right? So in some cases, if someone's blind, for example, and they don't have other ready means, to have a guide dog at home is a great alleviation and a great facilitation. And then one should look at what guidelines to follow in terms of ritual purity and so on. And when things are difficult, rulings become more expansive. Right? But when there are ready alternatives, that the same thing could be fulfilled by other than keeping a dog at home, then one would avoid it. Because generally one avoids it unless there's a genuine need that cannot readily be fulfilled otherwise. And in those cases, one looks, in the specific case, at the options available. Are there other ready options that would fulfill these, the specific needs, etc.? And in those cases, it'd be good then to follow up with the specific case that we consulted, the experts in this, and this is what they advised. And so one takes, because a fatwa in these kinds of things relates to a specific situation, right? But in general, if there is a need that cannot otherwise be fulfilled readily, then there would be a dispensation, like there's a dispensation for a guide dog, for a blind person, or a vision impaired person, if they don't have other ready means for that. Right? But for example, I have, one of my teachers was blind, but he was to go around all over town on his own without a guide dog, etc. Why? Because he would have people. He gained a sense of, he was able to guide himself around the city and so on, and then there's ways to determine these kinds of things, but that depends on particular circumstances. There's a follow-up question. Go ahead.
Oh no, it's just separate.
Yeah, go ahead.
Topic.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I was just curious. This is related to getting married. So, if you were to do the nikah and the rukhsati separately, what are the guidelines around that in terms of how are the guy and the girl allowed to interact?
Yeah.
And would there be a transfer of guardianship?
Yes. So.
At what point?
There's two parts. So if a man and woman get married, firstly, is it permissible to separate the time of nikah, of the actual marriage contract taking place, and then moving in together, right? Where you have the, in the subcontinent they call it the rukhsati, and then you have the walima, or you have the haflat al-zafaf, you have the farewell, the actual marriage ceremony where you celebrate that they're now going to be living together, right? And they give it different names. In some Arab countries, they give it pretty scandalous names, which I won't mention because it will only make sense in the context of the Arab world, like in Jordan and elsewhere. But can you separate the two? Yes, you can, even if they're years apart, right? Even if they're years apart, you can get married. You can do the marriage contract, right? Of course, with all the requisite considerations of parental approval, etc., and have the actual moving in at a much later date. Just as two people are going to get married and they agreed, we're never going to move in together. I mean, it's a bit silly. Why do you get married then? But that's up to the two parties. So the two things could be separate. Once they do get married, however, they are now husband and wife. Right? They are now husband and wife. If they've agreed not to live together, then people stick to their agreements. And if you can't figure it out, then you end the marriage, right? Like if they say no, like the husband says, no, I insist you move in with me. He doesn't have the right to demand that if they've agreed to the contrary beforehand, right? Like if they're in university, two people fell in love or something, first year. Let's say, well, we can't move in together because they're studying in different cities or whatever. You could get married and then later have the nikah, so you safeguard yourself against it, and move in together later. But once they're married, legally, they're husband and wife. Okay, they're legally husband and wife. Can they meet alone, etc.? Purely legally, yes, because they're now husband and wife, and all the implications of that apply. However, sometimes there are customary restrictions placed in different cultures because of considerations, right? Sometimes it's not announced that they're married. They just had the private ceremony, and now for them to be, alone, etc., it could raise question marks and so on. But purely Islamically, it's permissible. What the guidelines would be in that period, they should agree in advance, right? If they've agreed in advance to them, then they hold that is like a promise that people make, so they hold themselves to it. It raises sensitivities because very often people in that situation, they get married, now they want to consummate the marriage, etc. Because usually people don't get married because they dislike each other. Typically they like each other, and hopefully they'll like each other a lot, and one thing can lead to another. Whereas parents don't want their kids to be outside their circle of direct influence, and parents get very queasy about these things. So it can lead to a lot of sensitivities. But purely legally, it is permissible. Um, but one should think those things through beforehand, right? One should think those things through, both between the couple and also how it would interface with the two sets of parents. Wallahu a'lam.
What is the ruling in Islam of the niqab and the burqa?
I mean, there's no text in the Quran and Sunnah that talks about the burqa, right? Firstly, the burqa is one type of dress, right? Is one type of dress. What has come, right, in the Quran itself, right? Firstly, with respect to dress of both men and women, is that one cover one's nakedness. Right? It's very clear in the Quran that the children of Adam have been commanded to cover their nakedness. And we've been commanded in the Quran itself to be modest. Yeah, to be modest, both in the outward expression of modesty and in one's conduct and dress. Right? That is something that applies to both men and to women. What is one's nakedness, what is one's awrah, has been made clear by the Prophet ﷺ. What is the awrah for men and what is the awrah for women? Right? So that has been made clear. And the dictates of modesty have been made clear, that both men and women must dress in a manner that is modest, that covers their nakedness, and does so in a manner that is loose, right? That is loose and dignified, right? So that it would, because that is, that's what is entailed by the command of Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That applies to both men and women, and there's a lot of neglect in that on both sides, and with men as well. A lot of men, in terms of the trousers that they wear, particularly around the mid area, etc. One of the scholars put it very nicely: if it's not dignified for you to be in prostration with it, then question whether you should be wearing it. Right? You'd call that the PCT, the prostration clothing test. That go into prostration, into the sunnah prostration. If that clothing is not dignified for you to be in prostration with, and as a Muslim, you should be prostrating a few times a day. And as a Muslim man, you should be prostrating with other people. Right? Right? Then, if you can't make ruku' and sujood in it in a manner that's dignified, then that dress is not dignified dress. And a lot of men are very negligent of that, and a lot of sisters are not sufficiently careful. Allah has made women beautiful, right? That's just one of those realities. And there are specific guidelines above and beyond that related to women in the Quran. Particularly that the khimar, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about two things, the khimar and the jilbab. The khimar, which is interestingly, comes from the same root as khamr, which is the name for wine. Right? And wine is called khamr because it covers over the mind. Right? And the khimar is, and it's been described in the Quran, and you can refer to the verses. We have a number of answers on the Seekers Hub Answer service that detail the specific texts. But the khimar has been commanded that the head covering be such that it covers over the woman's chest area. Right? For obvious reasons. And there's no specific text in the Quran that talks about the hijab. Right? We have hijab mania. Right? So people will wear hijab in revealing ways. There's no command. You can say there's no command in the Quran to wear hijab. The command is that one cover and one do so modestly. Right? So the khimar is the head covering, so to speak, or however one covers oneself, top down, is that it cover one's head and neck and one's chest area. And the second thing that has been referred to in the Quran is the jilbab. Right? Now the jilbab does not is the scholars, when they look at what is meant by jilbab and what are the meanings of the Quran and Sunnah related to the jilbab is a loose overclothing. And that is an outer garment that loosely covers the woman's body. So you could have something that fulfills the criteria of the jilbab and it's not a jilbab. Right? And you could have a jilbab that is not a legal jilbab if it's tight and revealing. Right? But the idea of having an overgarment that is loose and flowing, right? That fulfills the aim of covering the body and doing so loosely and modestly. Those are the two things that are commanded in the Quran and clarified in the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? But the same value applies in a distinct way to men. Right? That we should be looking thoughtfully at how men cover themselves in a loose and dignified manner. And it's not an accident. Even in the West, it would be considered almost scandalous for someone to go to work not wearing a jacket of some kind. Why? Because it's almost shameful to be wearing something that doesn't cover your mid-area. Right? Loosely. Trousers were much looser. Actually, in the Middle Ages, they wore things that looked like shalwars. Why? Because there's a deep sense of what is considered modest. Okay? Right? And many of these values, they're just common sense human values. And then what is considered encouraged dress. It was only till the mid-20th century that an American president would be seen regularly in public without their head covered. Right? Just look back. Right? People who know US history, it's a given. And when do you see portraits of European kings not having their heads covered? Right? Only like people working the fields or something would not have their heads covered. Right? And this is just a basic human thing. Why? Because it's part of the ikram, the divine honoring of the human being. Okay? And some of these things we should take quite seriously. In some contexts, we may not be readily able to do so at work or in other cases, and the Sunnah gives leeway. But we need to consider both what is the minimum and what is the Sunnah related to our dress that is both modest and that is dignified. Okay. Wallahu a'lam. We'll take one more. Any questions here? Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Suppose you're distracted by something a lot, like you're looking forward to something, you're excited, and it preoccupies you during prayer or other ibadah. What can you do to sort of clear your mind, clear your heart?
So if it has something preoccupying your mind and you get distracted, what can you do to clear your mind? Well, one of the things that help with focus in general is to have some action that serves as a barrier between your source of distraction and the thing that you want to be able to focus upon. Practically, now we see in the Sunnah a number of discrete actions that have spiritual benefit, but they're also meant to serve as a barrier between our worldly preoccupation and our prayer. One is the Sunnah of renewing wudu, that even if you're upon wudu, if you fear distraction, one of the things to do is renew your wudu. Even if it's be the minimum wudu. And even physiologically, the act of focusing on a discrete action, right, between your worldly preoccupations and the prayer will help you. Right? And we know spiritually this helps a lot as well. Right? Also, even if you're really busy, taking a few moments, the Prophet ﷺ encouraged getting to the prayer early. Right? So get to the prayer early and sit down, recite what is facilitated of the Quran, a little of the Quran, even if it be a few lines, and read from an actual text of the Quran. Right? It forces you to focus on something outside your preoccupation. You read something, you make some dua. Right? All of this now has shifted your focus away. Then if you start the prayer, you'll find it'll inshallah be much easier. Anytime you struggle for focus, one of the things the ulama mentioned that helps is to make a quick dua. Okay? And sometimes it's a case that you do your best. You do your best. You have a relative who's in surgery and there's all these guests, all these visitors coming from all over and 101 things going on, but you need to pray. Okay? So you may not have full presence of mind. The Sahaba struggled with it. We know from Sayyidina Umar, he said sometimes he'd be thinking about how to arrange his army during the prayer. But that's not because he was playing a game of chess, right? Because there's a battle going on, right? And so this is Sayyidina Umar saying that sometimes one's mind, right? But those are exceptional cases. In those cases, you ask Allah to do your best. And if one makes one's habit to pray with presence of heart, etc., then you'll find facilitation in those challenging circumstances. We know from the hadith of Ibn Abbas, which is hadith number 19 in the 40 Nawawi, the second narration, تَعَرَّفْ إِلَى اللَّهِ فِي الرَّخَاءِ يَعْرِفْكَ فِي الشِّدَّةِ. Get to know Allah when times are easy, and He'll know you when times are testing. That if you become accustomed in your normal prayer to have presence of heart, then when you're in those testing circumstances, you've stepped away from an urgent meeting at work, you're praying during an exam, you're praying while someone's in surgery or whatever, that if it's your habit to have presence of heart, then you're much more likely to have presence of heart outside. Like in those situations. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala alam, wa huwa hasbuna wa ni'mal wakil. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا من فضلك علما وعملا وإخلاصا وتوجها إليك وقبولا يا رب العالمين. Wallah, we ask you for sincerity and taqwa, and that we direct ourselves to all that is pleasing to you, Ya Rabbil Alameen. And then when we're faced with difficult choices in dunya or deen, that we strive to choose that which is most likely to be pleasing to you. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.